The controversial video games Iceberg explained. Hello everyone, and today I'm going to be covering the controversial video games Iceberg. The creator of this iceberg is Reddit user RaceCarCoconutJuice. Shout out to you if you're watching this. With all that being said, let's begin with the top layer. The GTA series. I don't think I need to introduce you guys to GTA. In fact, I'm sure that those of you who have never played a GTA game are well aware of its endless list of controversies. From the very beginning, GTA has been endowed in controversy because of its violent nature. With every new GTA release comes a new controversy, whether that be the hot coffee mod, torture scenes, prostitution, or just in general the violence. GTA is one of the most popular yet controversial video game franchises out there. Manhunt and Manhunt 2. Manhunt and Manhunt 2 are a series of video games developed by Rockstar Studios, the same studio behind the GTA franchise. The first game has you play as a death row inmate who's given a second chance at life if he participates in the development of a snuff film. The second game has you play as a schizophrenic scientist who escapes a mental asylum and goes around discovering conspiracies on illegal experiments. Both games were controversial, however the second game received way more criticism than the first, with Manhunt 2 being banned in 8 different countries and receiving heavy censorship in others. Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat is a series of fighting games, the first of which being released all the way back in 1992. Despite other fighting games like Street Fighter being popular at the time, Mortal Kombat was controversial because of its gore content, mainly in the fatalities. I mean, if this was bad in 1992, imagine how they'd react to today's Mortal Kombat fatalities. Postal. Postal is a series of video games where you take control of the postal dude and go around just wreaking havoc. This series was controversial for many reasons. Violence, inappropriate humor, stuff like that. Despite all that, the series still remains popular and even managed to get a freaking movie with J.K. Simmons. You're telling me J. Jonah Jameson was in the Postal movie? What the fuck? Hatred. Hatred is a video game where you take control of a nameless character only referred to as the antagonist. The antagonist has a deep hatred for humanity and thus sets himself out on a mass murdering spree. The game has you kill as many innocent people as possible before you die yourself. Now, unlike previously mentioned video games, there was no satire or societal commentary in the game, just kill as many people as possible for the sake of it. The developer of the game, Destructive Creations, said that the reason for the game's creation was in response to political correctness and censorship in video games. They wanted to create a deliberately provocative game without making up reasons to justify it. Despite this, Hatred has been banned in numerous different countries around the world, including my own country. Doom. Doom is a pioneer in the video game industry. Without it, I'm sure thousands of FPS games would not have been made. But of course, in 1993, guns, blood, and video games did not mix well. Doom was criticized for its gore and violence as well as its satanic imagery, with different people saying that Doom teaches your kids to worship Satan. Controversy around Doom would kick up yet again in the wake of the Columbine High School massacre, in which one of the shooters, Eric Harris, was a pretty big Doom fan and even made custom levels in the game. But of course, just like most of the other games I've mentioned, Doom would continue to gain popularity and release numerous games over the course of its lifetime, with even a newer game set to release in May of 2025 called Doom: The Dark Ages. Duke Nukem 3D. You guys want to know why this game was so controversial? Just combine everything I said about the other games and that's why. Violence, crude humor, pornography, the fact that this game was released in the 90s. That's why Duke Nukem was so controversial. Blood. To put it simply, Blood was basically just Doom, except you'd go around killing cultists rather than demons. Just like Doom, it was controversial for its blood and violence. Carmageddon. Carmageddon is a vehicular combat game in which you get points for running over civilians. Yeah. By running over civilians, you would get splatter points and or combos. The game would even reward you for the type of person you'd run over, like cops or the elderly. The deaths were over the top gory, which would lead to many bans around the world. Gun. Gun is a 2005 Western themed game developed by Neversoft, the same people behind Tony Hawk. Its main controversy laid within its depiction of Native Americans, depicting them as savage and violent enemies with no real representation of Native American culture. Bully. Surprise, surprise, it's another Rockstar game. Bully's main controversy came from its title. The title, Bully, made it sound like it was a bullying simulator, when in reality, the game was actually about being sent to a school full of bullies and having to navigate your way through the school. Wolfenstein 3D. Wolfenstein 3D is a game where you play as a spy escaping from Castle Wolfenstein, a place filled with Nazis. Despite the fact that the game has you kill Nazis, the inclusion of Nazi iconography in Adolf Hitler was controversial, and, no surprise, the game was banned in Germany. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Conker's Bad Fur Day is a game where you play as Conker the Squirrel, who has a hangover and tries to make his way home but ends up fighting a bunch of weird enemies. The game includes lots of dirty humor and sexual content, but its main controversy was how family-friendly the game looked, being similar in design to games like Crash Bandicoot or Banjo-Kazooie. It was this design that made parents angry as they bought the game for their kids thinking it was family-friendly, only to realize that it wasn't. Saw. Saw is a video game based on the movie of the same name. Now, if you know anything about the Saw franchise, then you know just how gory the franchise is. And that's why the video game was so controversial, because of its heavy gore content and torture scenes. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 No Russian. The infamous No Russian mission. For those unaware, in the video game Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, there consists of a mission called No Russian, in which you are an undercover CIA agent who attempts to infiltrate a terrorist organization by gaining the trust of the main leader. How do you do this? By entering Moscow airport and killing innocent civilians in a terrorist attack. Yeah, it's easy to see why this was so controversial at the time. Not everyone was a fan of letting players commit terroristic acts of mass murder, even if you didn't have to kill anyone yourself. I mean, the game even allowed you to skip the mission if you didn't want to do it. If anybody in the 2000s was talking about violence in video games, it was either involving GTA or this mission. Of course though, many people praised the mission for it pushing boundaries and how it didn't make light of the situation, and it was even still featured in the remaster of the game. 6 Days in Fallujah. While this game did just come out 2 years ago, it has had a long history. The game has you play as Marines and civilians during the Iraq War. The game was first announced by Atomic Games and Konami in 2009. 2009, while the Iraq War was still going on. Of course, both studios got tons of backlash for this, so they dropped the game. It wasn't until 2021 when Highwire Games in Victoria would pick it up. The game would finally be released on Steam in early access in 2023. While the reviews on Steam seem to be mostly positive, there is still some controversy around the game, mainly involving how they made a game on a still very recent war. Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops: The Line is a 2012 video game where you play as Captain Martin Walker as he leads a Delta team into Dubai to take care of rogue American soldiers. The game's main controversy came from its infamous white phosphorus scene, in which the main character uses white phosphorus in order to kill enemy soldiers from a distance. However, you later find out that you also killed a bunch of innocent civilians, including a mother and her child. I also just found out that the game just got removed off Steam, so there's that too. Custer's Revenge. Oh boy, Custer's Revenge. I can't even really show the cover art or any gameplay. Widely considered to be one of the worst and most tasteless video games ever made, Custer's Revenge has you play as General Custer, as you make your way through the desert, dodging arrows until you reach a naked Native American lady tied to a pole. and then proceed to forcibly and unconsensually have sex with her. I don't think I need to explain why this game was so controversial. Kingpin Life of Crime. Kingpin Life of Crime has you play as a criminal rising through the criminal ladder in a dangerous urban city in order to take down a kingpin. The game's main controversy came from the brutal and violent fights in the game, as well as the sheer amount of swear words tossed around in the game. Paranoiascape. Paranoiascape is a very surreal and unsettling horror game in which you navigate through a maze of nightmarish body horror with a pinball that interacts with different monsters. On release, the game wasn't controversial as it was only released in Japan for the PlayStation 1, but as time went on and as copies were shared, people began to find out more about this game. Some people did not like the disturbing design of the game, while others found it to be an interesting psychological horror experience. South Park: The Stick of Truth. South Park, the TV show version of GTA. A show that's been involved in all sorts of controversy from the very start. And that's no different for the South Park video game, South Park: The Stick of Truth. If you know South Park, then you know what kind of controversy this game would be in. Crude humor, religious jokes, offensive jokes, etc. The EU and Australian releases of the game had certain scenes cut, such as an abortion and alien probe scene, which was swapped out for these funny little screens right here. Whiplash 2003. Whiplash 2003 is a game where two creatures, Spanx the Weasel and Redmond the Rabbit, try and escape from an animal testing facility. In the game, the character Spanx is invincible due to past experiments, so the player has to use him as a sort of weapon, which leads to Spanx being subjected to different forms of abuse. Multiple animal rights activists were not happy with the themes of this video game involving animal testing and abuse. However, the publishers of the game said that the purpose of the game was to raise awareness for this kind of stuff, which seemed to mitigate a lot of the controversy as the game received fairly decent reviews and wasn't banned or censored anywhere. Leisure Suit Larry Magna Cum Lord. What the hell did I just read? So the Leisure Suit Larry series is a series of video games about a man named Larry who attempts to seduce women in funny ways, oftentimes embarrassing himself. The reboot of the franchise, however, Magna Cum Lord, was controversial because of how much more nudity was featured in the game and because of how raunchy it was. Even the original creator of the series didn't like it, stating that it was originally about this guy who went after hot girls, mostly getting humiliated but eventually getting lucky, but Magna Cum Lord was about how you can get girls drunk enough that she'll get in bed with you. State of Emergency. State of Emergency is a game developed by none other than Rockstar Games. The game is set in a dystopian future where corporations have taken control over governments. Players join the resistance and begin committing acts of violence and organizing riots in order to take down the corporations. The game was controversial due to it promoting violence and riots. Now, since the game was released in 2006, this may have just been controversial at the time because the plot sounds suspiciously similar to Cyberpunk 2077. Cosmology of Kyoto. Cosmology of Kyoto is a Japanese point-and-click video game set in the city of Kyoto. The game explores the city's history, religion, and mythological aspects. While not outright controversial, at the time not a lot of video games had such historical or religious themes. LSD Dream Emulator. LSD Dream Emulator is a surreal Japanese video game that doesn't really have any sort of story. You just walk on through these extremely unsettling and off-putting landscapes. The game wasn't really that controversial at the time, mainly because it only saw limited releases in Japan. But from what was being talked about at the time, some people did not like the surreal look of the game, and the title LSD Dream Emulator didn't really help out with that. Death Race. Death Race is an arcade video game in which players take control of a car and have to run over creatures referred to as gremlins to get points. Despite the fact that the game looked like this, This was 1976, literally 4 years before Pac-Man became a thing, so any sort of violence in video games was not okay. Night Trap. Night Trap is a 1992 full-motion video game released on the Sega CD. You play as an agent watching a house filled with teenage girls hiding from intruders. You need to monitor the house and trigger traps to prevent the intruders from getting to the girls. Now, the only real justifiable controversy were how the girls were oftentimes wearing revealing clothing, but that's about it. The other controversy was about how the game encouraged violence against women, even though the whole point of the game was to protect the girls. So yeah, really there was nothing wrong with this, just people losing their minds after not understanding what the game was actually about. Thrill Kill. Thrill Kill is a 90s 4-person fighting game. Similar to Mortal Kombat, it was controversial because of how gruesome the kills were. However, it was also controversial for its designs of the main characters, most of the fighters having BDSM-style designs. Bone Town. Bone Town is an action-adventure porn game where the player is set in a town and has to complete certain missions and has to do various sexual activities with women. The game was controversial for its objectification and stereotyping of women. Harvester 1996. Harvester 1996 is a point-and-click adventure game where you play as a teenager named Steve, who wakes up in an old town called Harvest. The people in Harvest seem to be some sort of cult, as you need to join the Order of the Harvest Moon. How do you do this? Well, by committing acts of violence, cannibalism, domestic abuse, and even child murder. Based on the last couple things I just said, it's easy to see why this was so controversial. What didn't help as well is that the game used FMV, which stands for full motion video, meaning that they used photos and videos of real actors rather than computer-generated graphics, which of course made the game's violence and gore all the more disturbing. The Punisher. Based on the Marvel comic book series of the same name, the Punisher game has you play as Frank Castle, as you go after criminals to get vengeance for your family who were murdered by criminals. The game was controversial for its violence, alongside the sheer amount of torture scenes. A lot of torture scenes were cut from the game. However, PC modders managed to mod them back into the game. A lot of people claim that the game was glorifying violence and torture. However, today the game is praised for it being very faithful to the Punisher comics. Super Seducer. Super Seducer is a dating sim that presents itself as a seduction training lesson. The game was made by Richard Lorena, who is a quote-unquote pickup artist. I mean, seriously, this guy looks like if Ben Stiller and Jared Leto had a kid. Anyway, the game is an FMV, which, like I said before, means full motion video, so instead of computer graphics, they use real photos and videos of actors. In the game, you have to seduce girls by selecting the right choices. The game was controversial for numerous reasons. One reason was because it was making it seem like women were challenges or puzzles that you had to complete. Some of the choices seemed a bit creepy and borderline sexual harassment. And then there was the fact that the game seemed to be promoting toxic masculinity and harmful dating ideologies. Raid Over Moscow. Raid Over Moscow is a 1984 video game set during the Cold War. You play as an American pilot responding to a Soviet nuclear missile attack. So you need to defend the USA by destroying USSR missile bases in Moscow. It was controversial for its propaganda-like themes and how the final stage of the game requires you to blow up Red Square. Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose is a psychological horror game where you play as a girl named Jennifer who's trapped in an old orphanage run by psychotic children. While nothing directly about the game is controversial, the main controversy came from suggested themes of child abuse and pedophilia. Phantasmagoria. Phantasmagoria is yet another point-and-click horror FMV game. You play as a female novelist that moves into a haunted mansion. How original. As the story goes on, the main character begins having creepy visions and her husband becomes a lot more abusive over the course of the story. eventually to the point where he rapes her. Now, because this was an FMV, the gore and torture scenes were way more brutal, which is where most of the controversy around this game comes from. Left Behind Eternal Forces. Left Behind Eternal Forces is a religious strategy game set in a post-apocalyptic New York City during the Rapture. In the game, you command a group of Christians known as the Tribulation Force as you fight against a fictionalized version of the Antichrist army referred to in the game as the GCP. In the game, you need to convert as many people as possible to Christianity. It was controversial for its religious supremacy, showing that Christianity is better than other religions. There was also the alleged Islamophobic themes in the game, as well as the fact that violence in a faith-based game is pretty weird. Standoff. Standoff is a mobile FPS game which is literally just a clone of CSGO. There were some small controversies surrounding this game. Because the game was free and on mobile, people were concerned about how easily accessible the violent content within the game was to children. Bad Mojo. Bad Mojo is a 1996 point-and-click horror game where you play as a man who has transformed himself into a cockroach. You have to navigate through the apartment you lived in as a human while avoiding dangers and piecing together parts of your life. The game was controversial because of its dark themes of suicide, mental health, and abusive relationships, while also being controversial for its use of gross images of decomposing food and dead animals. Space Funeral. Space Funeral is a very surreal RPG game where you play as Philip, a boy who is constantly crying and lives in a dark, bloody world. In the game, Philip goes on an adventure joined by a floating, talking pile of flesh who is referred to as Leghorse. The game already sounds like an acid trip. The game was controversial for its grotesque aesthetic and nihilistic undertones. Seaman. Seaman is a very weird virtual pet game released in 1999. The game features a fish with a human face that you are able to speak with if you had a microphone. The game was controversial for its weird and uncanny visuals. Some people believe that the game was a metaphor for evolution, which would anger a couple of religious groups. Also, I'd like to add that this game was published by Sega and featured the likes of Leonard Nimoy from Star Trek. Just thought I'd add that. Super Columbine Massacre RPG. Okay, now we're starting to get into the really bad territory. Super Columbine Massacre RPG is based on the real-life Columbine High School massacre. In the game, you take control of the two real-life shooters responsible for the event, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, as you prepare for the attack and when you actually begin the attack. It's obvious to see why this game was so controversial. Recreating a recent real-life tragedy that took the lives of innocent school students was not well liked at all. Many people felt that the game tried to humanize the shooters, and attempted to make light of the whole situation. Arlay. Okay, this one's really bad. Arlay is a Japanese hentai game where you play as a man who was recently released from prison. As revenge for being arrested, you have to stalk, harass, and eventually rape a mother and her two daughters. Not only that, but you can impregnate those characters and then force them to get abortions. It's easy to see why this game was so controversial. The game encouraged sexual violence. Not only that, but the game's marketing was targeted towards minors as well. To this day, Arlay is considered to be one of the worst and most disgusting video games ever made. Chiller 1986. Chiller 1986 is an arcade game made by the same people behind the previously mentioned Death Race. In the game, you need to torture innocent and helpless people in dungeons and execution chambers. You can torture people by shooting their limbs off, using medieval torture devices, or grinding them into meat. Even though it is pretty pixelated, I'm not sure how much of this I can show, so here are a couple of blurred screenshots from the game. Of course, even today, a torture simulator would be controversial, so one in 1986 would have made tons of people upset. This would lead to tons of bans around the world and lots of arcade venues refusing to have the game in their arcade. Ethnic Cleansing. Ethnic Cleansing is a 2002 first-person shooter game which is considered to be one of the most racist video games ever made. For one, the game was made by National Alliance, which is a neo-Nazi white supremacy group. In the game, you need to cleanse your city by killing everyone who is either black, Jewish, or Latino. Eventually, at the end of the game, you need to kill the Prime Minister of Israel. I don't think I need to explain why this game was so controversial. Everything I just said is the reason why this game is hated. JFK Reloaded. JFK Reloaded is a video game that attempts to recreate the events of the JFK assassination. The player gets points for how accurate you recreate the event, down to the time, bullet angle, and where you shot. The game was controversial as people believed that they were using a national tragedy as entertainment. Even the Kennedy family said that the game was despicable. The developers of the game did come out with a reasonable statement, saying that the game is meant for educational purposes and that the game attempted to disprove the second shooter theory. However, that didn't stop the game from becoming one of the most controversial games released in recent times. Quest for Saddam. Quest for Saddam is a Doom-inspired FPS game released right around the beginning of the Iraq War. In the game, you play as an American soldier who has to fight off Arab terrorists. The game was controversial as it released 2 months after the war began, leading many people to believe it was capitalizing on the war. It was also controversial for its stereotyping of Muslims and Arabs as a whole, saying that they're all terrorists. Fatum Batella. Fatum Batella is a horror exploration game where you explore a dreamlike decaying world centered around a leafless birch tree. In the game, you need to take care of this tree with different liquids. While the game wasn't super controversial like some of the previously mentioned ones, it did spark debates around its body horror, nihilism, and cryptic story. Pakistan Army Retribution. Pakistan Army Retribution is a 2015 FPS mobile game made to raise awareness for the 2014 Peshawar school massacre, where over 140 people died at the hands of Taliban gunmen. Despite the game being made as an anti-terrorism game, it still received a massive backlash. The Peshawar school massacre was a pretty big and emotionally sensitive event in Pakistan, and turning that into a video game, let alone a first-person shooter, just seemed very disrespectful and exploitative. Schnell Online. So this is a very weird and obscure game. The developer of the game is credited as Saint Olvin, who is apparently responsible for other titles called 14/ and. In the game, players are randomly given one of 10 characters. The primary objective involved getting a gift for an in-game girlfriend, leading to a visit to the theaters, and then a surreal event involving UFOs and weird creatures. Schnell Online wasn't that controversial. Many people just found it more weird than anything. The main controversy of the game was the fact that you could only get this game via accessing the dark web. JB Harold Death Club. JB Harold Death Club is a 1986 murder mystery game. The main controversy was the game's mature themes of murder and assault, which at the time were pretty controversial themes to have in a video game. Zog's Nightmare. Zog's Nightmare is a series of neo-Nazi video games in which the players have to fight Jewish soldiers, all the while white supremacy songs play in the background. The game was controversial for its neo-Nazi propaganda, anti-Semitic content, and promotion of violence. Quest for Bush. Quest for Bush is a mod for the previously mentioned Quest for Saddam. The game was released in September of 2006 by the Global Islamic Media Front, an Al-Qaeda propaganda organization. In the game, you have to go through 6 different levels before reaching George W. Bush and killing him. The game was controversial for its promotion of extremist ideology and violence, and its assassination of George W. Bush. It was ultimately ruled as a piece of terrorist propaganda. Waxworks. Waxworks is a 1992 horror game where you have to make your way through a dungeon. The game was controversial for its realistic and intense gore and violence. The Guy Game. The Guy Game is a trivia-style game where players have to complete mini-games and answer choices correctly while being shown videos of real-life women in bikinis. The game had what was called a flashometer, where if players got enough points, the meter would be filled up, and the girls would take off their bikinis and flash the players. The game landed itself in the middle of a lawsuit as it was found out that one of the girls in the game was actually 17 and never actually consented to appear in the game. 177. 177 is a 1986 Japanese erotic game. The title, 177, is a reference to the Japanese penal code for rape. In the game, you take control of a man who is chasing down a woman who is running from you. If you catch the woman, then, well, you kidnap her and I'm sure you know what happens. If you don't catch up to her, then you get arrested. Obviously, having a game where the objective is to kidnap and rape a woman, yeah, it's easy to see why this game was so controversial. Demonophobia. Demonophobia is a Japanese indie horror game developed by someone who goes by 237. In the game, you play as a high school student trapped in hell after a failed curse. The game was controversial for its extremely detailed and gory scenes, and its difficulty to complete as the game was made without any save features. Hell 79. Hell 79 is an indie horror game where the player is trapped in a surreal and creepy environment. The game doesn't seem to have a clear story and is rather just used as a horror experience, with disturbing visuals and creepy sound design. While there hasn't been any mainstream controversy, there is a lot of controversial features, like its disturbing atmosphere and less than conventional mechanics. LostBoy.exe. LostBoy.exe is a simple maze game with scary images and sounds. However, a user on 4chan would spread around an altered version of this game. This version carried a RAT, which stands for Remote Access Trojan. Once this Trojan was installed on the user's computer, the person who originally distributed the malware would be able to breach into the user's PC and basically do whatever they pleased. Polybius. So I'm actually just going to skip over this one, as Polybius is not a real video game, it's just an urban legend, so yeah. Station.exe. Station.exe is yet another indie horror game from 4chan. The game doesn't really have a clear story or objective. There are these weird floating moon-like faces referred to as lunars that, when interacted with, will close the game. According to accounts online, an anonymous 4chan user discovered the game on a CD purchased at a tech expo in New York. The CD contained 2 discs, one with engineering software, and another with the game Station.exe developed using Blender. While not outright controversial, there are still some discussions on the game's mysterious origin. Sentai Arcade Cabinet. Sentai Arcade Cabinet was an arcade cabinet from the 1980s developed by Bally Sentai. The arcade cabinet was developed so whenever a player was idle, images of real-life missing children would appear on screen. The company says that it was to raise awareness for these missing children. However, a lot of people believe that an arcade cabinet was not the best place to put photos of missing kids. Kawaii Shashin. Kawaii Shashin is a Japanese horror game where you play as a young exorcist. In the game, players have to analyze distorted images, some of which are based on real photographs, in order to identify and exorcise spirits. Now, the main controversy around this game comes from urban legends. Supposedly, this game had a cursed development, as the developer of the game died under mysterious circumstances, and the use of real photographs led to misfortune among the development team. Shortly after the game's release, the studio behind the game would shut down. And lastly, Some players reported experiencing physical discomfort or unease while playing the game. Drowned God Conspiracy of Ages. Drowned God Conspiracy of Ages is a 1996 point-and-click adventure game. The game links numerous conspiracy theories, suggesting that human history has been manipulated by otherworldly forces. Players have to navigate through surreal environments, solving puzzles and uncovering the truth about humanity's origin. The game was controversial for its use of conspiracy theories and use of forged manuscripts. And we are now finished with the controversial video games iceberg. Went over some pretty disturbing and heavy topics, but I hope you guys found the video interesting. It's been a while since I made one of these iceberg videos, so I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Once again, shout out to RaceCarCoconutJuice for creating the iceberg, and I'll see you guys later.